We are now 2 weeks from Election Day, and the candidates continue their frantic dash to the finish line. Donald Trump was in Miami, Florida this morning for a roundtable with Latino voters and will headline a rally tonight in Greensboro, North Carolina. Harris is sitting for interviews today with NBC News and Spanish-language Telemundo. Tonight, she'll be in Detroit for a rally featuring former President Barack Obama and rap icon Eminem. Joining us to discuss this and more, Brett Samuels, White House reporter for The Hill. Brett, when you look at the schedules for both candidates over the rest of the week, what do you think it says about the state of the race?
Yeah, I think you can read a lot into where the candidates are spending their time. You know, for Vice President Harris, she spent virtually all of last week in these blue wall states of Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. As you mentioned, she's headed back to Michigan this week. She'll be back in Pennsylvania on Wednesday for the CNN town hall that she's doing. When you look at former President Trump, he's in North Carolina twice this week. He's been in Pennsylvania a lot. So I think you can get a pretty good idea of which states these candidates think are going to decide the race.
And both candidates are trying to make this economic pitch, especially when it comes to Latino voters. As we mentioned, Trump was doing that roundtable with Latino voters at his golf club in South Florida. Harris is going to be speaking with the Spanish language news organization Telemundo. Polls show the vice president underperforming previous three Democratic candidates when it comes to Latino voters. How do you think both campaigns are going to try to target them in their closing message?
Yeah, and we should note both candidates actually did Univision town halls in the last couple of weeks, so another example of sort of outreach to this very important voting bloc. Obviously, for Vice President Harris, a lot of this is about consolidating the support that Democrats have typically enjoyed with Latino voters. She's lagging a bit behind where President Biden stood in 2020. For Trump, he's trying to make the case, that things were better for Latino voters just as they were for every other demographic 4 years ago. Economically, when it comes to immigration, he's pitching this idea that he will be tough on illegal immigration, which appeals to some Latino voters. So certainly that's a voting bloc we're seeing a lot of focus on in the closing stretch here.
Democrats in the blue wall states, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, are keeping a little bit of a distance from Kamala Harris and even the Biden administration. These are all very close races, and the candidates in them are striking sort of a populist tone. They're hitting tough on China, even highlighting their work with President Trump, former President Trump, when he was the president. This is pretty normal for Democrats in purple states, but do you think it can tell us anything about the state of play in those states?
Yeah, certainly. I think if you're reading into this, it suggests that maybe Kamala Harris is not sort of, a tide that's lifting all boats for Democrats in some of these swing states, that Democrats feel like to win these races in Wisconsin, in Michigan, in Pennsylvania, where there's these key Senate races, that they need to cross over with their appeal a bit. They need to win over some Republican voters, some moderate voters who maybe aren't fully on board with Kamala Harris. As you mentioned, some of these ads are highlighting their ties to the Trump administration and the work they did in those 4 years. So certainly I think, a sign that maybe Kamala Harris isn't just coasting to victory in these states.
Speaking of one of those swing states, Pennsylvania, kind of seen as the granddaddy of them all here, also has a very close Senate race between incumbent Democrat Bob Casey and Republican businessman and challenger David McCormick. The Cook Political Report recently switched that race from leans Democrat to a toss-up. Why do you think that race is tightening?
Yeah, certainly I think Pennsylvania, as you said, is really this critical state where the Trump campaign is spending a lot of time, a lot of resources. J.D. Vance, the vice presidential candidate for Republicans, has been in Pennsylvania, not quite every day, but multiple times a week. Former President Trump has been there multiple times, so Republicans are really sinking a lot of time and energy into Pennsylvania. So I think the importance of the presidential race is sort of elevating the Senate race in importance and in attention. And when it comes to David McCormick, I think Republicans who I've talked to feel like he is a strong candidate, feels like he can connect on issues like the economy. Obviously, he ran a couple years ago in the Senate primary, lost to Mehmet Oz in the bid to run against John Fetterman, but he seems to be having better luck this time around. And as you mentioned with that Cook report, this race does seem to be tightening down the stretch.
Let's talk about another Senate race, this one in Nebraska, where there is actually an unexpectedly close race for U.S. Senate. Incumbent Republican Deb Fischer is being challenged pretty strongly by independent union worker Dan Osborne. Now, this is another race that Cook recently switched its status report, changing it from likely to lean Republican. And we're also getting signs from national Republicans that they're a little bit worried about this race. Tell us about that.
Yeah, certainly Republicans for a Nebraska Senate race, that's not typically one that you would expect Republicans to sink resources into, that they would focus their attention elsewhere. But they've had to, spend some money on this race in Nebraska, which is a bit unexpected. Now, as you noted, it still is more likely than not, I think, that Deb Fischer is going to win re-election here. She's going to stave off this challenge. But certainly this independent bid against her, I think, is a sign that maybe this victory is not going to be as easy as possible. There could be some ripple effects. Nebraska's 2nd congressional district and its lone electoral vote is obviously very important for the Harris campaign to win, so maybe a sign there of some Democratic strength in Nebraska, but certainly one that Republicans, are going to maybe not quite sweat out, but are going to have to sink a little bit more resources into than they would have liked to.
Let's go to Texas, where the state's Attorney General Ken Paxton is urging federal regulators to crack down on Act Blue. Act Blue is a progressive fundraising platform that brought in $1.5 billion for Democratic candidates in the third quarter, just an ungodly amount of money. Talk about the importance of Act Blue and what it has become for the Democratic Party, and what is the accusation from Paxton and other Democratic attorneys general?
Yeah, so Act Blue is, certainly it's this sort of go-to fundraising platform for Democrats across the board, not just the Harris campaign, not just Democratic Senate candidates. All Democratic candidates essentially use this platform to fundraise. As you mentioned with that haul, it's been very successful for them, bringing in cash for the campaign. Now, Ken Paxton and some others are accusing Act Blue of using straw donors essentially to boost the amount that they're able to raise, with people, not necessarily using their names when they're giving money to sort of inflate the total that is actually being raised by individual donors here. Now, Ken Paxton, of course, has raised various claims about voter fraud that have yet to bear out in Texas. So, and he's someone who's certainly been praised by former President Trump, has been in Trump's good graces. So certainly some politics being played here, but notable as Harris has, very comfortably outraised the Trump campaign, that he's coming forward with these allegations. Let's
head overseas. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is in Israel today. He's trying to calm tensions in the Middle East after the killing of Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar. He's hoping also to make progress on these ceasefire negotiations. And is there any indication that we're any closer to a ceasefire?
Not especially, I would say. Certainly he's in Israel. It's sort of this, I don't want to say last-ditch attempt, but certainly, the election's in 2 weeks. There's sort of this narrow window for the Biden administration to get something done before Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and others could sort of see who's going to be the next president and maybe decide they'd rather deal with that person, whether it be Trump or Harris. But the Biden administration certainly saw the death of Sinwar, the Hamas leader, as this opening to try again, essentially, to maybe see if there was anything there. But certainly no indications early on that this is going to be some kind of breakthrough visit, I think.
And what's happening in the Middle East is affecting the presidential election. There's this new poll that shows Donald Trump with a slight edge over Kamala Harris when it comes to Arab American voters. This could be crucial in a key state like Michigan that has a high Arab American population. Many see this as frustration over the Biden administration's handling over the war in Gaza. It's interesting. One wouldn't think that former President Trump is any more pro-Palestine than Harris or the Biden administration. In fact, he's probably more pro-Israel. But what do you think is driving this shift toward Trump among Arab Americans, and how does that compare to what we've seen in previous elections?
Yeah, certainly to your point, whenever Trump is on the trail, he's consistently touting his support for Israel, saying, that he was the best president for Israel, with some of the moves he took during his administration, recognizing the Golan Heights, moving the U.S. Embassy, things like that. And he hasn't really given many specifics when it comes to, how he would see the end of this conflict, or how he would, get more humanitarian aid into Gaza, for example. So to your point, there haven't been many specifics we've heard from Trump to suggest he would be the better candidate, but I think that just speaks to the frustration that a lot of voters have with how the Biden administration has handled the Israel-Hamas war, how they've handled this broader conflict in the Middle East, that they have continued to stand by Israel despite sort of these public frustrations. That hasn't really affected their actions. Vice President Harris has certainly been sympathetic to the plight of Palestinians, but she hasn't articulated specifics of how she might act differently on policy. So I think at the end of the day, it is sort of this division among Arab Americans where a lot of them are frustrated with the Biden administration. The question is, do they check the box for Trump? Do they just skip the top of the ballot altogether? Certainly it will be interesting to see how that pans out in a state like Michigan. It'll
be interesting to watch the third party vote in those states too among Arab Americans. Another poll shows Kamala Harris leading by 20 points among younger Americans. The poll was done by CNBC and Generation Lab. It shows Harris leading Trump 60-40 among voters under 34. Now, this is actually an improvement for where Harris was at this summer when polls showed Harris with a slimmer lead. Do you think this reflects Harris's efforts to court young voters?
Yeah, I think so. That's been a really concerted effort from this campaign, is to reach those younger voters. I think there's an awareness from the Harris campaign that they need to run up the score among younger voters, young women in particular. Obviously, we saw her go on the Call Her Daddy podcast, was an appeal to younger voters. The Harris campaign was running ads on DraftKings and Yahoo Sports apps to kind of appeal to young men in particular who might be on those betting apps. She went on a podcast with a couple of former NBA players. There's been this really concerted effort in the last month or so, I think, for the Harris campaign to reach young voters, to reach young men in particular. And this poll, I think, is a sign that maybe she is consolidating some support in that group that was already probably leaning Democratic, but certainly she needs to run up the score there.
One more survey that I want to talk to, and maybe it's not so positive for the future of democracy in this country. It says nearly 1 in 5 Republicans think that if Trump loses the election, that he should declare the election invalid and assume power by force. Trump for years has been sowing doubt over the election results. Now, to be fair, 1 in 10 Democrats say the same thing about Kamala Harris, so it cuts across to a certain extent both sides. But what do you make of these numbers? Yeah,
certainly I think, like you said, it's just sort of an effect of this sort of corrosive rhetoric that we've seen in the last 4 years, especially where in 2020, obviously, you had Trump where he refused to accept his defeat. It led to January 6th and the violence at the Capitol. Trump still hasn't accepted his election defeat. Just a couple of weeks ago, he had a whole news cycle about, J.D. Vance refusing to say that Trump lost in 2020. I think there are a lot of fears and anxiety among Democrats that we could see something similar pan out in November. Certainly Trump has given no indication that he's going to just accept the election results if he loses. And for Democrats, I think there is this fear about Trump potentially taking power and this anxiety about what might happen. And so certainly I think just anxiety about the election is fueling this. But certainly long term, like you said, does not inspire confidence about where things stand when that many voters are that skeptical of the fairness of elections and accepting election results.
And I'm sure I could imagine there would be a lot of anger among Democrats if Donald Trump wins, and would be interesting to watch and see how they react to that potential scenario.
Absolutely.
Brett Samuels, thanks so much for joining. Always enjoy your insight.
Thanks, Drew.
With only 2 weeks until Election Day, both candidates are focusing on swing states like Pennsylvania and Michigan. But what was once a blue wall may be more purple than in past elections. NewsNation's Brian Enton and Robert Sherman are reporting on the issues most important to voters in those states. Let's start with you, Brian.
We are on our road trip across America. We're calling it Driving the Vote, where we go literally from coast to coast talking to voters. We are in Ohio now. We drove about 6 hours from Pennsylvania. That was our last stop. And in Pennsylvania, of course, critically important swing state. Democrats have won 8 of the last 12 elections, but it's very, very close. And just like throughout the country, in Pennsylvania, the black vote is very, very important. The urban areas like Philadelphia traditionally vote very Democratic. But it's interesting, we went in this barber shop that is mostly African American, spoke to men there, and many of them said that they were actually considering for the first time not voting Democrat this time around and voting for Trump. They feel like in a way they've been taken advantage of, and that Harris has not paid enough attention to some of the black communities in Philly.
You got to build, you know what I mean? You got to build a community. If you want individuals to keep voting for you, you got to build those type of individuals.
I would love to see her more in the black community, more in small business communities to actually see what's really going on.
While, Philadelphia obviously predominantly expected to go Democrat, even changes like that in small numbers could end up having a real impact in a state where it's already so close. All right, we're going to keep driving. I'll send it over now to Robert Sherman.
Thanks, Brian. Without question, the state of Michigan has been top of mind for both the Harris and the Trump campaigns as both sides try to put those highly coveted 15 electoral votes into their column. And talking to Republicans and Democrats in recent days, of course, there are some differences in opinion, but there are also some correlations. And you see some top issues that are floating to the surface, namely personal economics, the economy as a whole. That is what is on the minds of so many Michiganders here. Listen for yourself.
Building the automotive, getting us into more clean energy.
Supporting the UAW, supporting working class people.
We know that when I go to that gas station and when I go to that grocery store, I know that, my money is going really fast.
And the polling metrics back this up. A study conducted by AARP this month found about 57% of Michiganders age 50 and up put a personal economic issue into their top two. That's all encompassing. That includes inflation, that includes the economy as a whole, that includes taxes and everything that goes along with that. Both of these campaigns trying to hone in on this message, particularly here in Michigan, in a state that is razor thin, less than 1 percentage point separating the Trump and Harris campaigns, according to the latest Decision Desk HQ average of polls. So the countdown is on until November 5th, but here in Michigan, over 1 million absentee ballots have already been cast. Drew?
NewsNation's Robert Sherman and Brian Enton, thanks for your reporting. That's today's Daily Debrief. I'm Drew Petrimoulx. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Hill's YouTube channel, and come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.